Chapter 48 of This Country of Ours. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. This Country of Ours by H.E. Marshall. Chapter 48. How a Terrible Disaster Befell the British Army. We have now seen something of the great struggle between French and British for the continent of America. War after war broke out, peace after peace was signed. But each peace was no more than a truce, and even when the noise of cannon ceased, there was nearly always war with the red man, for he took sides and fought for French or British. And as years went past, the struggle grew ever more and more bitter. If the French had their way, the British would have been hemmed in between the Alleghenies and the sea. If the British had had their way, the French would have been confined to a little strip of land north of the St. Lawrence. It became plain at length to everyone that in all the wide continent there was no room for both. One must go, but which? The peace at Aix-la-Chapelle was not a year old before the last great struggle began. Both French and British had now cast their eyes on the valley of the Ohio, and the spot where Pittsburgh now stands became known as the Gateway of the West. The British determined to possess that gateway, but the French were just as determined to prevent them ever getting through it. So the French began to build a line of forts from Lake Erie southward to the Gate of the West. Now, Virginia claimed all this land, and when 2 French forts had been built, the governor of Virginia began to be both alarmed and angry. He decided, therefore, to send a messenger to the French to tell them that they were on British ground, and to bid them to be gone. It was not an easy task, and one which had to be done with courtesy and firmness. Therefore Dinwiddie resolved to send a "person of distinction." So as his messenger he chose a young man named George Washington. He was a straightforward, tall young man, well used to a woodland life, but withal a gentleman, the descendant of one of the old Royalist families who had come to Virginia in the time of Cromwell, and just the very man for the governor's purpose. It was a long and toilsome journey through pathless forest, over hills, deep snows, and frozen rivers, a journey which none but one skilled in forest lore could endure. But at length, after weeks of weary marching, Washington arrived at Fort Le Boeuf. The Frenchmen greeted him courteously, and entertained him in the most friendly fashion during the 3 days which the commander took to make up his answer. The answer was not very satisfactory. The commander promised to send Dinwiddie's letter to the governor of Canada. "But meanwhile," he added, "my men and I will stay where we are. I have been commanded to take possession of the country, and I mean to do it to the best of my ability." With this answer Washington set out again, and after many adventures and dangers arrived safely once more at Williamsburg. In the spring the Frenchmen marched south to the Gateway of the West. Here they found a party of British who had begun to build a fort. The French, who were in far greater numbers, surrounded them and bade them surrender. This the British did, being utterly unable to defend themselves. The French then seized the fort, leveled it to the ground, and began to build one of their own, which they called Fort Duquesne. Upon this Dinwiddie resolved to dislodge the French, and he sent a small force, and when its leader died he took command. But he was not able to dislodge the French. So after some fighting he was obliged to make terms with the enemy, and march home discomfited. Up to this time the war was purely an American one. France and Britain were at peace, and neither country sent soldiers to help their colonies. It was the settlers, the farmers, fishermen, and fur traders of New England and New France who fought each other. And in this the French had one great advantage over the British. The French were united, the British were not. New France was like one great colony in which every man was ready to answer the call to battle. The British were divided into 13 colonies. Each one of the 13 colonies was jealous of all the others, each was selfishly concerned with its own welfare, and quite careless of the welfare of the others. But already the feelings of patriotism had been born. Among the many who cared nothing for union there were a few who did. There were some who were neither Virginians nor New Englanders, neither Georgians nor Carolinians, but Americans. These now felt that if they were not to become the vassals of France they must stand shoulder to shoulder. A congress of all the northern colonies was now called at Albany to discuss some means of defense. And at this congress Benjamin Franklin proposed a plan of union. But the colonies would have nothing to say to it. Some took no notice of it at all, others treated it with scorn, or said it put too much power into the hands of the king. As to the king, when he heard of it he rejected it also, for, said he, it gave too much power to the colonies. So for the time being nothing came of it. Meanwhile the governors of the various colonies wrote home to England, and, seeing how serious the matter was becoming, the British government sent out 2 regiments of soldiers to help the colonies. They were about 1,000 men in all, and were under the leadership of Major General Edward Braddock. As soon as the French heard this, they too sent soldiers to Canada. It was just like a game of catch who catch can. For as soon as the British knew that French troops were sailing to America, they sent a squadron to stop them. But the French had got a start, and most of them got away. The British ships, however, overtook some which had lagged behind the others. As soon as they were within hailing distance, a red flag was suddenly run up to the masthead of the British flagship. "Is this peace or war?" shouted the French captain. "I don't know," answered the British, "but you had better prepare for war." He, however, gave the Frenchmen little time to prepare, for the words were hardly out of his mouth before the thunder of cannon was heard. The Frenchmen fought pluckily, but they were far outnumbered, and were soon forced to surrender. Thus both on land and sea fighting had begun. Yet war had not been declared, and King George and King Louis were still calling each other dear cousin or dear brother, and making believe that there was no thought of war. But the little success on sea was followed up by a bitter disaster on land. General Braddock now commanded the whole army, both home and colonial. He was a brave and honest man, but obstinate, fiery-tempered, and narrow. He had a tremendous idea of what his own soldiers could do, and he was very scornful of the colonials. He was still more scornful of the Indians. "These savages," he said to Franklin, "may indeed be a formidable enemy to your raw American militia, but upon the King's regular and disciplined troops, sir, it is impossible that they should make any impression." The haughty savages were quick to see that he looked down upon them. "He looks upon us as dogs," they said, and drawing their ragged blankets about them, they stalked off deeply offended. With the same narrow pride, Braddock turned away another useful ally. This was Captain Jack, the Black Hunter. He was a white man, but he roamed the woods dressed like an Indian, followed by a band of men as reckless and lawless as himself. The Black Hunter, however, although he dressed like an Indian, was the white man's friend, the red man's deadly foe. He had been at one time, it was said, a peaceful settler living happily with his wife and children. But one day he returned from hunting to find his cottage in ashes and his wife and children dead among the ruins. In his grief and rage he vowed eternal vengeance on the Indians who had done the evil deed, robbing him forever of home and happiness. Henceforth he roamed the woods, a terror to the red men. For his aim was unerring, he could steal through the forest as silently as swiftly as they, and was as learned in all the woodland lore. His very name indeed struck terror to the hearts of all his foes. Black Hunter now with his wild band of followers offered his help to Braddock. They were well armed, they cared neither for heat nor cold, they required no tents nor shelter for the night, nor did they ask for any pay. General Braddock looked at the gaunt, weather-beaten man of the woods, clad in hunting shirt and moccasins, painted and bedecked with feathers like an Indian. Truly a strange ally, he thought. "I have experienced troops," he said, "on whom I can depend." And finding that